Take it away, Paul.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this important webinar on recent developments in the Middle East. Of course, the focus of many of us has been on Ukraine and this terrible war there, and at the same time, things are happening in the Middle East that kind of confuse many of us and seem to be very important. And for those of us who've focused on the Middle East for quite a while now, in terms of trying to support the welfare of people in the area, it's a little bit confusing just what's happening. And we hope that this webinar, which is the first in a series of 3 webinars on these developments and the implications for those of us who do want to express solidarity with the peoples of the Middle East. This is the first, and we're going to get off to a wonderful start today. We're just so lucky to have Trita Parsi and Joshua Landis with us this evening to share their time and their thoughts about the meaning of these developments. And so I think we'll just get right into this. Brian Garvey from Mass Peace Action is running the show behind the scenes here tonight, and I'm Paul Shannon on the executive committee of Mass Peace Action. So on behalf of MAPA, we want to welcome everyone to this event. So Trita Parsi, we've been very fortunate to have Trita speak to us a number of times over recent years, and we most appreciate it that he's willing to continue to do this and share his expertise and his research and his reflections. Trita is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Now, there's a group that's been very, very helpful to all of us on a number of issues over recent years. Trita is also the founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. MAPA has in the past worked with them very closely on sanctions related to Iran. Trita regularly writes articles and appears on TV to comment on foreign policy. In fact, you'll see him all over YouTube these days. And he is the author of Treacherous Alliance, A Single Roll of the Dice, and also of Losing an Enemy. So, Trita, thank you so much for being with us here this evening. We're going to start our event with Joshua Landis from the University of Oklahoma. Joshua is Sandra Mackey Chair in Middle East Studies, Professor of Middle East History, and Director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Since 2004, Joshua has published the blog Syria Comment. And if there's any crisis in the Middle East which requires better understanding, it is certainly Syria, and some important events are taking place around Syria. So we'll begin. First of all, welcome Joshua and Trita, and we'll begin with Joshua's presentation.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure being with you. It's a pleasure being invited by Massachusetts Peace Action and to share this floor with you and with Trita Parsi, who I admire a great deal. Let me just make a few remarks in opening about great power rivalry in the Middle East between China and the United States. And I want to make a few remarks about the relationship between the U.S. and the United Arab Emirates first, and then Saudi Arabia second, and I'm going to then move to Syria third, to show how the United States has no longer the dominant hegemon in the Middle East. It certainly is a powerful player. It has the largest army. Its security profile is biggest in the Middle East. But China has been coming on with economy, with trade, and so forth. And it's a much more complicated world in the Middle East, and the United States power has been slipping. If we just start with just the other day, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, said it's a world in which the US is no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. And he added the weight of the hedging middle is growing. These countries see little benefit and lots of risk in monogamous geopolitical relationships. And now when he said that, he was really referring to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, because the Saudis and Saudi commentators have used this word monogamous relationship in order to, in a sense, poke at America a little bit by saying we're no longer in a monogamous relationship, we're in a polygamous relationship. And of course, they're patting themselves on the back a little bit by using this term. So he's quoting the Saudis on this. And he remarks that the relationships in the United States, these countries are going to be pursuing much more open relationships, and they're going to be looking to benefit from China and from Russia as well. And this makes the playing ground much more difficult from the United States. Now, to put this in some perspective, in 1960, the United States' share of global GDP was 40%. That has declined. Today, it's 24%, which is still a tremendous amount for a small portion of the world's people. But it relatively, China and other countries like India and so forth, and the BRIC countries are coming on like gangbusters, and they're feeling their strength. And this is allowing countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Turkey to play both sides against the middle in order to profit from this. And this leaves the United States in a quandary. Let me just throw out a few numbers to begin this. In 1975, the US economy was over 3 times larger than that of Japan, which was the next largest economy. Today, China leads the world in manufacturing output. China is $2 trillion, or 20% of world industrial output. The US is 1.8 trillion. That's 18%. Japan, 1 trillion. That's 10%. Germany, 700 billion, excuse me. And South Korea has about half that much again. So today, China and the United States, in terms of industrial output, are really in arm wrestling. What does this mean? It means that the US interests in the Middle East, which traditionally looked at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates as their bailiwick. They offered security, and in exchange, they got oil, and they got a very important seat really at the table with OPEC to set oil production and pricing. And this was, of course, key to US hegemony in the world, because being able to control the flow of oils and the price of oil made America a superpower. And it's losing some of that power, as we've seen most recently, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others have not listened to the United States. Even when Biden has asked them to cut supply and to raise oil, to flood the market with oil in order to try to bring down prices and alleviate inflation in the United States, Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries have said no. Now, one of the big questions then that is dominant is, has the US lost the UAE and Saudi to Russia and China? And if we look at a little bit of the politics in both these countries, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE, has recently rejected to meet with Biden. He was given an invitation a number of months ago by Biden to come to Washington. He hasn't turned up, and he hasn't responded. The UAE is seeking to maximize its own security and economic growth by expanding its relations with Russia and with China. Now, the Emirates are upset with Washington, And they're upset. We can take it to a number of causes, but let's start with Obama negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran without bringing the Emirates or Saudi Arabia into the negotiations, largely leaving them out. They felt blindsided, and they felt like this was an abandonment of America's traditional role supporting the Gulf countries against Iran. Obama called the Emiratis free riders because they were getting this American umbrella without paying much of a price, and that upset MBZ tremendously. Then when there were drone attacks on the UAE by Yemen, by the Houthis in Yemen, supported by Iran, both in 2018 and 2023, Trump and then Biden did very little to respond. This infuriated, of course, the UAE, which felt vulnerable. The United States also has put technological restrictions on both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. During the Abraham Accords, the key exchange between Mohammed bin Zayed and Netanyahu and the United States was that the US would sell about $20 billion worth of its most advanced fighter planes, the F-35, these stealth bombers and so forth, to the UAE. And the UAE would recognize Israel and open up the Abraham Accords. But when Biden came to power, the Congress began to throw up a bunch of caveats. He wasn't sure that he wanted to give that kind of technology, and he began to make demands because the UAE was working with Huawei to get 5G and the Chinese, telephone company. And this was a no-no for Washington because it believes that with this kind of coverage, all of the secrets of their aircraft would be open to Chinese spying. And so they said, you can't have this Huawei 5G. And another thing is the United States discovered that that China was building a military base secretly in the UAE. And they asked them to stop it. And just this year, it looks like further work is going ahead with China on this base. And so the United States has scotched this sale. And we have to remember that, especially in Congress, there's a lot of pressure to keep the qualitative military edge. The United States with Israel. The United States has an agreement with Israel that any combination that Israel should be able to defeat any combination of Arab states by preserving its qualitative military edge. That means that Israel should have F-35s, but not the Arab countries. And Congress has been policing that. So this, of course, upsets the UAE. It upsets Saudi Arabia. And they've begun to look abroad because other countries have very good fighters. And they want the technology, they want missile technology. And both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are now working closely with China to put satellites in the air, to develop missile technology, and to move ahead with a lot of high-tech development. So this is the background, which shows how difficult it is for Washington. And Washington is very worried about this. They worry that the UAE is inviting and is being used to export high tech to Russia. And I was just in the UAE this March for a week. I was invited by Israeli Russians to speak to about 100 wealthy Russian businessmen who are considering moving their businesses to the UAE, to give them a sort of tour d'horizon in the Middle East. But this was just one group. The Russian businessmen are flocking to the UAE to set up their businesses, to get out of sanctions, and to be able to work on an international basis. And the the United States has been following this very carefully. It's been complaining like mad because sophisticated chips exports have been going up radically. And other high-tech stuff that the United States is trying to keep from Russia has been going through the UAE. So the UAE has been, sanction busting for Russia, and the United States is beginning to put sanctions on various UAE entities, but this is putting them at cross purposes, and it's infuriating many locals. Now, the UAE is the second largest economy in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia. It's growing at 7.6% a year. It's doubled the size of its economy. It will double the size of its economy by 2031. It's China's second largest economic partner in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia. Bilateral trade between the US and UAE in 2021 was $23 billion. Between Saudi Arabia and the US, between US and UAE, it's 23 billion, but between China and the UAE, it's $75 billion. And the same kind of difference is between Saudi Arabia now and the United States. And only a decade ago, the United States was bigger than China. Today, China is about $90 billion worth of trade with Saudi Arabia, and the United States is about 45 billion. So China is more than double the trade with the Gulf countries. So they're listening to China, and they're beginning to invest in the Chinese stock market. Trade between the UAE and China is projected to be $200 billion by 2030. There are 6,000 Chinese businesses operating in the UAE and a big Chinese community there. So these are some of the problems that demonstrate how the UAE is moving out of America's orbit pretty rapidly. And Saudi Arabia has been doing exactly the same thing. Saudi Arabia has its own grievances. Of course, President Biden said that he was going to treat Saudi Arabia as I'm forgetting the word right now, but he was going to treat it as a pariah, and that he wasn't going to make any arms sales. And of course, he's had to back away from that because Saudi Arabia has gone elsewhere, and it's moved towards China with missile technology, and it's looking to Saudi Arabia now for nuclear refineries and so forth. And Saudi Arabia has asked the United States, you can build my nuclear power plants, but you have to do it without many restrictions. And we will consider the Abraham Accords, but this is one step too far for Washington. And Saudi Arabia is moving towards China on these things. So this demonstrates, really it undergirds some of the problems that we're to address today, which is how the United States is losing its edge in the Middle East. And major powers, these secondary powers, are moving towards Russia and towards China in order to counterbalance the US, in order to secure their own security interests, and in order to grow their economies as fast as they can. They don't want to be restricted by the United States. And just to complete, let me just turn to Syria for 2 minutes here. And both the UAE and Saudi Arabia spearheaded an effort this spring to bring Syria bring Syria back into the Arab League and to normalize relations with President Assad and the Syrian government after 12 years of civil war, of supporting the opposition, of working shoulder to shoulder with America to try to force Assad from power. That ended up in tears. The country is largely destroyed today. There's almost about 1 to 2 hours of electricity a day for most Syrians. Now they're sweltering in Damascus heat. I was listening to Radio Damascus today, Sham FM, and everybody was complaining about the terrible heat because there's no electricity and they're just sweating in their apartments. So this is the Saudi and the UAE have decided we can no longer support sanctions and support trying to bring Syria to its knees. We've got to engage. Assad has won. But America is working against those interests. And there's an important bill in Congress right now, 3202. It's a House bill to prolong sanctions, to extend sanctions by another 8 years on Syria, and to double down on them. And this is an in-your-face to both Saudi Arabia and the UAE and to the entire Arab world, which is said that we can't crush Syrians anymore. We have to normalize, and we have to accept that that Damascus has won this war. And the United States is putting itself at cross purposes with most of its partners in the Middle East. And this is going to push them towards Russia, towards China. And the talk of trying to present the Ukraine war as democracies against autocracies has also alienated Middle Eastern powers, because they're all autocracies. And they see in Russia and China, in many ways, a more convivial political arrangement that doesn't demand too much from them and is willing to do business. And so this presents America with a real dilemma in how to engage with Middle Eastern countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joshua. That's I don't think too many of us were aware of a lot of that economic data and the changes that has taken place in the Middle East along those lines. Let's go right to Trita Parsi to get his overview of the situation. Trita?
Thank you so much, Paul. As always, great pleasure to be with all of you. I'm so thankful for the tremendous work that you all are doing, particularly in these very, very critical times. Always a pleasure to be with my good friend Josh Landis, who I always learn so much from. And so what I'm going to try to do here is perhaps find a way to complement a little bit of what Josh was talking about. I agree fully with Josh about the manner in which the U.S. is losing interest, is losing out in the Middle East. But I think we have to ask ourselves why that happened, but also losing out for what purpose? What is it that we would try to retain if we were to do so? What's the value of that? Because there's a part of me that thinks the United States, not necessarily playing that big role that it used to play in the Middle East in the past, is actually not a bad thing. Certainly, a lot of folks in Washington would see that as the US being in retreat, etc., or viewing any gain China or Russia is making as coming at the expense of the United States. But what we're seeing here is that these countries are starting to pursue their own interests, monogamous, no longer monogamous, as Josh put it. The question is, are we pursuing our own interests? And have we done so in the past? And why did we end up in this type of a scenario? So let me say a couple of things as to why I think we have ended up in a rather poor situation in the United States. There are many factors that explain how we have approached the region and how we have defined our own security in this region. But I would say that there are two key myths at the foundation of our outlook that is essential in shaping our policy in the Middle East in the past. The first myth is that for America and the world to be safe, we must dominate this specific region as well as certain other regions. So we have to dominate in order for us to be safe. And without our domination, without American hegemony, this region would descend into chaos. The only thing that stands between prosperity, stability on the one hand, and chaos on the other hand is America's military might. Based on these two myths, we have then defined our interest in the region accordingly. So we have defined our interests such as protecting the oil, defeating terrorism, spreading democracy, preventing vacuums, meaning keeping Russia and China out, and then perhaps the most, in my view, dangerous and perhaps the most relevant in this context, interest as we have defined, which is the catch-all interest. We have an interest in supporting our allies. Let's pause for a second and contemplate what that means. Supporting our allies, if that is an interest in and of itself, it means that the interests of our allies are suddenly also our interests. And then you can see how suddenly the way we need to be involved starts to exponentially grow, because not only do we have to focus on our interests, now we have to focus on all of these allies' interests as well. And incidentally, none of them, with the exception of Qatar, are actually treaty allies. They're more strategic partners. This is part of the reason why we then have ended up in so many conflicts in the region, Because as Josh mentioned, Yemen, and I know you guys have been working very hard on ending that war. And the question has always been in my mind, what was the interest of the United States to be involved in that war in the first place? What is it specifically that we were trying to achieve? What was it specific that, for instance, the rise of the Houthis truly threatened US interests to the point in which we either were involved militarily or were supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE in that war? Well, there really isn't much of a US interest. Rather, it is the idea we have to support our allies. This has just gotten us involved in so many different conflicts, embroiled us in these conflicts, and as a result, has created a very damaging situation for the US in which we are not on talking terms with most countries in the region, and the ones that we talk about as strategic partners increasingly are moving away from us. Now, the reason I call it myths is because if we assess whether these myths, these assumptions actually have made the United States or the region more safe, I think the answer is quite clear. If we take a look at the first myth, the idea that we have to dominate in order for there to be, for us to be safe. These expansive definition of our interests has led to endless wars, because if we believe that we have to constantly dominate so many corners of the world all the time, well, if we need to dominate so many corners of the world all the time, we will be at war somewhere all the time. These endless wars that we have are not coming out of nowhere. They're a direct result of us defining our interests in the manner that I just explained, and our belief that we have to dominate in order to be safe. It has minimized US's maneuverability because we're simply not on talking terms with some of the most important players. We get stuck in the conflicts even as other countries start to move beyond the conflicts. And the Syrian example is a perfect one, because you have some of the most anti-Assad elements in the region coming to the conclusion that they've lost the war, they have to make up, they have to find some sort of a modus vivendi, because continuing the warfare is actually to the detriment of everyone. Yet we are there standing in the way of this and passing more legislation to try to make any type of recognition or reconciliation more difficult. Other countries' conflicts become our conflicts, and it has completely destabilized the Middle East. In 1998, there were 5 military conflicts in the region. By 2020, there were 22 conflicts, armed conflicts in the region. Now, all of them are not the fault of the United States in any way, shape, or form, but many of them are a direct result of the US's invasion of Iraq and the destabilizing impact that had. And at the end of the day, as long as we, even though we don't say it out loud, but nevertheless, as long as we are the de facto hegemon of the region, then it kind of falls at our feet that this instability is taking place here. Moreover, we've actually kind of poo-pooed other countries' efforts to pursue peace and stability. We've seen that as at least a challenge to us being in charge in the region. And all of these things, I think, is safe to say has made the United States less safe and made Americans less safe just as much as it made the region less safe. And if you want some statistics on how it's been bad for the region, I think the fact that it's cost the United States taxpayers $6.4 trillion, the cost of the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, according to the Cost of War Project, and the fact that the same organization out of Brown University have also made an assessment of the number of people who have been killed by the Global War on Terror, and those are primarily in the Middle East. And that number is a staggering 4.5 million people over the course of roughly the last 20 years. It's really difficult to defend that track record in any way, shape, or form. Now, would chaos have ensued if the US didn't dominate? Could we have made the argument that perhaps the situation would have been even worse if we didn't do this? I think if we assess that, I think we reach a rather different conclusion, because over the last 10 or so years, we've moved to a situation in which the United States increasingly has signaled the region that we're kind of shifting our gaze elsewhere. Asia is more important. The Middle East is getting a disproportionate amount of our resources and attention. At first, many of these countries resisted this. This is why the Emiratis and the Saudis were very upset about the Iran nuclear deal because they recognized that if the US resolved that issue, it would actually make it easier for the United States to start moving out of the region and not pursuing this level of hegemony. But two events that really concluded to many of these leaders that the US was serious about this is one of them is the attack that the Iranians conducted against Saudi Arabia in 2019 in September against their oil fields. And they expected that the United States would go to war with Iran because of that attack, because it was a violation of the Carter Doctrine, essentially. And Donald Trump essentially believed that this was a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It didn't involve the United States, and he took no action. And then you had the Houthi attack that Josh also mentioned. And I think the one that is the most important one is perhaps the one that took place in January 2022. And the reason for why it's so important is because the Emiratis wanted help. They got no help from the United States. And this time around, it was Biden who was in office. So if one could perhaps have dismissed the case in September 2019, with it being because of Trump's peculiarity, well, it was more or less repeated by Biden in 2022. Which incidentally, I think was the right decision by Biden. But nevertheless, it meant that the Emiratis came to the conclusion that the US truly is leaving the region, because even if it keeps troops in the region, we clearly don't have the will to fight in or for the region any longer, nor should we. But it took a while for these countries to reach that conclusion. Now, here's where myth number 2 comes in. If it is true that us not being there or us not being willing to fight for the region would lead to chaos, then we would have seen more chaos after these events. Instead, what we've seen is a flourishing of regional diplomacy. And I think to a large extent, that is very much a direct consequence of these countries coming to the conclusion that America's hegemony in the region is coming to an end. They can no longer hide behind American military power. And as a result, guess what? Your next best option is actually to try to find some sort of a diplomatic modus vivendi with your neighbors. So we've seen the Saudis and the Iranians and their diplomacy. The Emiratis and the Iranians have normalized. The Turks and the Egyptians have normalized. The Turks and the Emiratis have buried a hatchet. The Saudis and the Qataris. It's really stunning to see what has happened. And it's completely contrary to the prediction of the myth, the prediction of conventional wisdom in Washington, which was that if we're not there, the region is going to descend into chaos. Instead, what has happened is that as we have stepped back militarily, the region has actually stepped forward diplomatically. And I would put the manner in which the Chinese now also have stepped in diplomatically with what they did between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same category there. Because the US side, we were so concerned that if we didn't support these countries, if we removed troops too fast, etc., we would create a military vacuum that the Chinese would fill. Instead, what happened is that the Chinese came in and filled the diplomatic vacuum that had been created not by our withdrawal, but by our militarized foreign policy in the region. So in my assessment, this is some of the key factors as to why we have ended up in this type of a scenario. And the Emiratis and the Saudis and these other countries are now essentially pursuing their own interests, and their own interest is to hedge their bets. Our interest should be, in my view, to recognize that this region is no longer that strategically vital. We don't need to have this military presence. If China steps in and stabilizes some of these conflicts by mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc., it may hurt us, or the administration at least, on a PR level. But ultimately, it's actually good for the United States that there is more stability in the region, and the fact that other countries, including the regional countries themselves, are shouldering that responsibility reduces the burden on American shoulders. This then also allows us to do a bit of a diplomatic reset with other countries in the region, because we want to increase our maneuverability, be able to be on diplomatic and talking terms with many different actors in the region, rather than continuing to double down on these relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, while they are doing everything they can to show that we're not the only games in town. So while there is a bit of a crisis, I think this is a crisis that in more than one sense is actually an opportunity for the United States if it plays its cards the right way. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Wow, Trita, thank you so much. I think we'll probably have a lot of questions on some of the points that have been raised. And we will have a chance in just a few minutes to ask those questions. But first, we'd like to use these webinars as certainly as educational forums. However, we also want to use them to help us engage in some of the political struggles going on in the world today that we really have to relate to. And so Brian is going to let us know something we can do right here along those lines. Brian?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Joshua and Trita, for some wonderful presentations, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. But we always like to use these as an opportunity to take action. And one thing that we're encouraging all of our activists and volunteers to do is comment on the recent decision to send cluster bombs into the Ukraine war, and the opposition in Congress that was not strong enough to prohibit sending these illegal weapons that really amount to a war crime into an active conflict in Ukraine. We have one member of Congress from here in Massachusetts who did more than just vote the right way. He was vociferous about it and released a public statement, and he has opposed these weapons for many years. And that is, of course, James McGovern, the congressman who represents Congressional District 2 and Worcester, Massachusetts. We want to recognize this by sending a message directly to him. I just put a link in the chat. He has been opposing these weapons for many years, especially when they were used in Yemen. We were not just sending these to Ukraine in the past, we sent them to Saudi Arabia for use in the war in Yemen. We used them in Southeast Asia. And as I'm sure many of you know, these weapons last sometimes for decades, and primarily it is civilians and, in fact, children that are harmed by these unexploded weapons that last for generations after the conflict ends. So if you click that first link, it'll send a message straight to Jim McGovern, thanking him for his opposition and asking him to do more, in fact. And if you click on this second link, it will send a message to whoever your representative is, letting them know about your concern regarding these cluster munitions. And at the end, we're going to have an action related to the piece of legislation that Joshua Landis was just speaking about, that threatens to codify harmful and, in fact, lethal sanctions against the Syrian people. So I encourage you to take those actions. It's very easy. And with that, enough out of me. I think we should get to the Q&A. What do you think, Paul?
Let's do that. Yeah. So if people could just kind of finish up, if you're willing to take one or both of those actions that Brian just outlined, that would be terrific. The way we're going to do the Q&A, the way we tend to do it is to have to ask people who have questions to use the reactions menu item at the bottom of your screen and to raise your hand. And what we'll do is we will, when we call on you, you will be allowed to unmute yourself and you can ask your question yourself. At least let's see how this works, okay? So let me get back into gallery format here. Okay. So let's start with William Root. William, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, I would. I'd appreciate comment on reviving the nuclear deal with Iran. That now that we have a Democratic president and Democratic Senate, it seems that we should be more active in reviving that nuclear deal.
Trita or Joshua, where are we at with the Iran nuclear deal?
That's the Trita question.
Thanks, Josh. And thank you, William, for asking that question. You're putting your finger on something very important. We have a Democratic president. We have a Democratic Senate. We had a Democratic House. We had a Democratic platform from 2020 that said that it was the policy of the Democratic Party to get back into the JCPOA. Unfortunately, the Biden administration did not believe that it was the highest priority or even a particularly high priority. And instead of just going back into the agreement right away, on day one, President Biden signed 50 executive orders. He undid the Muslim ban. He went back into the Paris Agreement, back into the WHO. He could have done 51 and just gone back into the JCPOA. There would have been some issues that needed to be resolved, but those could have been done from within the agreement. Instead, the administration decided to spend the next 10 weeks consulting with the three countries that oppose the JCPOA, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, to essentially try to find a way to get them to reduce their opposition. That, unfortunately, did not work. It was not likely to work at all. But it also meant that significant time was lost. And by the time the US was ready to negotiate, the Iranians were in their presidential campaign. And then, unfortunately, not completely unrelated, a very conservative president came to power there. Then the Iranians wasted time for more than 5 months. And then this process has continued, and we are now more than 2 years into the president's term, still have no JCPOA. The likelihood of reviving it is increasingly small. And the latest steps is that instead of trying to revive it because it seemed to be too difficult, there's only an effort to try to see if there can be a prisoner swap and an agreement to halt further escalation, but not actually halt the sanctions or the nuclear activities. And even that now seems to be too difficult to achieve. And that's a huge, huge lost opportunity. Hopefully it will work out. I think there needs to be far more pressure on the administration to take this issue more seriously and give it a higher priority. And I do think that it would be quite an irony if at the end of the day, the JCPOA did survive 4 years of Trump, even though he exited, but that it would die under Biden instead.
Yes, I've been working on that for a long time. Next question, Wade Willington.
Hello, sir. I'd like to say, to address the gentleman's question about the JCPOA, that's a moot point. They can forget about the JCPOA. That's a dead on arrival. I'm saying this because of the BRICS union that's been created. Since the BRICS has been created and the SCO is moving, that negates the JCPOA's its validity, because the JCPOA was supposed to help Iran enter into the market, and as far as the concern as the international market for trading. And with the Syria thing, once Erdogan and Putin sealed that pipeline in Nord Stream, that right there was the steep decline of them removing the United States from that region, because Syria right now, the United States is taking that oil. I would call it pirating the oil from there. So what has happened since the United States has dropped the JCPOA, and when Biden didn't come back in and rectify it as soon as he did, that let me know that they were all in the same accord against the JCPOA. And then what they did was, the reason why you see UAE move away from the United States, when Blinken went down to dress down the king of UAE, that's when he canceled the F-35s. And then when he canceled the F-35s for the Chinese fighters. Then from that point, when the United States said those things against MBS and the other GCC nations all got together to say, okay, we need to push United States out. This is why you see Iraq pushing United States out and saying that they're not using the US dollar in trade and they're making it illegal.
Okay, Wade, there's an awful lot there.
Well, I'll let somebody else
People
go,
can comment on.
Okay.
Did you have a specific question you wanted to ask the speaker?
Yes, I would like to know, what do they think about the BRICS nation coming on board, and do they see the decline of the U.S. Treasury notes and the $44 trillion budget that Biden has put forth? How are they going to sell those Treasury notes if the BRICS nation come on board on August the 22nd? Thank you.
Thank you, Wade. Would either of you like to kind of comment on any of the points that Wade made?
This is a Josh question.
Thank you, Trita. I think many Americans are, like Janet Yellen, have waved away this notion that other currencies could replace the US dollar and it's not threatened and so forth. That's on their good days. They're trying to say that America, the dollar is irreplaceable. But when countries come together and start working on these problems, it's clearly going to undermine America's currency role in the international community. And most trade, over 70% of trade, is done in dollars today, and that's a position that America wants to keep. And part of the reason that we're causing so much effort to displace us is because of sanctions and our really promiscuous use of sanctions, which have hurt so many people. I think something like 27% of the globe now are being sanctioned at some level, various countries, by the United States. And that's upset many people. And I think the sanctioning of Russia really gave this a fillip, because it made China shudder, it made Saudi Arabia shudder, and particularly the language of democracy versus autocracy, because countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, think we could be next. And the United States is not going to take much mercy on us. And they are going to be next. Already, we're beginning to put sanctions on these UAE companies in order to keep them from trading, in order to keep them from developing missile technology with China and Huawei. So this is a challenge that I think the United States shouldn't just whistle past the graveyard.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate that. Let's take a question from Shadi Sharafat. Let's need to unmute yourself, Shadi. Brian, are we able to unmute her?
Looks like she is unmuted. So you might want to mess around with your audio settings. I think it's on your end, but just we can come back to you. I will, in the meantime, just say Joshua was just telling us about the danger of sanctions, not only to the people that they directly affect, but also to the U.S. economy. And if you want to take action and tell your members of Congress to oppose this piece of legislation.
Does it work right now?
Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
You're on, Shadi. You made it. Yeah.
So glad we were able to get you. Go ahead.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh no,
Does it work right now? Oh, I cannot
Yes, we
hear
can-
you
we
right
can-
now. I'm sorry.
We can hear you, Shadi. Go ahead and ask your question. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me right now?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Sorry, my Zoom settings was messed up. So I have two questions in here. First is, I wanted to know if Trita has heard, and I'm sure he has heard, what's his opinion on the proposal from Vali Nasr and Ali Waez on regional approach to Iran's nuclear issue. And I think you are familiar with it. They made the proposal, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere. The other thing is, do you think in your mind US has any interest in really democratic and political development in Iran? Because currently with the sanctions, civil society is shrinking, is losing all the power. There are so many multiple facets to how detrimental this has been to Iranian society, to the democratic process, the massive corruption. Meanwhile, we hear from here and there that there are actually transitions from different places. It's just not official and causes a huge black market that, again, doesn't benefit the civil society, but just the corrupt sect of the Islamic Republic. And it makes you wonder if there is any will from, well, we know what the Republicans want, but like what Democrats are thinking with respect of the democratic process in Iran. Thank you.
Thanks, Shadi. Trita?
Thank you so much, Shadi. And first of all, I absolutely do agree with you. The impact of the sanctions have been tremendously detrimental to civil society in Iran and the cause of democratization. And Josh knows quite well of how detrimental it has been and currently continues to be in Syria as well with the sanctions. As to your question of is the United States really in favor of democracy in Iran? I would say democracy in Iran has never been a priority. I'm not saying that the government is deliberately working to undermine it, but if it was a priority, I think the administration, and not just this one, but the previous ones, would have taken a far more sober approach to the sanctions, recognizing, because they know very well how much is undermining the civil society. It's just that it does not matter that much because it's not been a priority. And I think most sober pro-democracy Iranian activists have a realistic understanding that at the end of the day, democracy will come from the Iranian people. It will not be delivered by any foreign government to Iran. And any struggle that is based on the idea of getting foreign governments on your side or expecting them to deliver it is bound to fail because it just fundamentally misunderstands how the power dynamics and how democracy comes into shape. I think in regards to, particularly when you see the protests of the last year, which likely are going to continue in a month or so on the anniversary, I think it's important to recognize that sanctions may increase the likelihood of protests taking place, but they decrease the likelihood of protests being successful. And moreover, they decrease significantly the likelihood of protests leading to a democratic outcome. So I think there is a feel-good element in some places, thinking that this is how you punish the regime. It's very misguided because ultimately it does the opposite. We've seen that clearly in Iran. We've seen that in Cuba. We've seen that in so many different countries that have been under sanctions. In regards to the question of doing a nuclear deal that instead of relying on the P5+1 relies on a regional arrangement, I find the proposal very fascinating. I don't know if it's politically viable or not, but it recognizes one thing. There is no P5+1. The United States and China and Russia could work together quite closely for the JCPOA almost 10 years ago. Today, it's impossible. The United States and China's relationship has deteriorated significantly. And the Russians believe that the United States is at war with Russia indirectly and approximately. So the P5+1 clearly does not seem to be working out. And I think it is very positive that they are thinking of alternatives, particularly mindful of the fact that with the rapprochement that is taking place in the region, the attitudes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE has also shifted towards the JCPOA. They may not love it, but unlike the Israelis, they recognize that it's better to have it than not to have it at all. Whereas as the Israeli perspective, at least the current government's perspective, continues to be one of opposing the JCPOA, opposing a shorter JCPOA, opposing a longer JCPOA, opposing no JCPOA. It's really unclear what they're in favor of because they're essentially on record of opposing everything. So thinking about these things, I think, is very positive. Whether they landed exactly right, remains to be seen. But the idea that perhaps there should be an arrangement that is more regional rather than with a P5+1 is in my view, an appropriate thing to think about these times, mindful of the fact that the P5 is dead, and there's a regional détente taking place.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Trita. I noticed that Elizabeth Axtell has been trying to ask a question, but not using the hand raised. Elizabeth, are you still out there trying to ask your question?
Let me see if I can find her.
Last name is Axtell.
AX?
T-E-L.
I think we lost her.
Oh, okay. Maybe she gave up on it. So let's go to Stephen McKnight.
Yes, I'm curious about what your picture of the effect of Israel on the United States influence in the Middle East. I mean, it's enormously important in American politics. AIPAC, the speech that Netanyahu was invited to give to Congress, and then when Trump came in, his turning the Middle East policy over to his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who again was to create things for Israel. And it seems to me that Israel has had the goal to reduce all of the powerful countries, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, and then Iran. I mean, those were the countries that Israel sees as threats, and they have succeeded in destroying Iraq, which had a significant military presence, and Syria, which of course has the Golan Heights, which Israel is occupying, and the effort to inspire an American attack on Iran has been, I think, very, very much part of Israel policy. So, am I just whistling in the dark here, or is this important?
Well, I think, if I can respond to that a little bit, I think you're absolutely right. It is, the United States has had sort of twin pillars in the Middle East in terms of interest. And of course, the first is Israel, but the second is Saudi Arabia. And President Trump tried to bring those two together. They've always been in tension, and the United States diplomatic policy has been to try to keep a buffer between the two and to keep those two issues separate. It didn't succeed in '73 with the oil embargo and the '73 war, and that showed the danger of what could happen. I think Trump, with the Abraham Accords, tried to use a very transactional way to buy Saudi Arabia and the UAE into a peace agreement that would disregard the Palestinians. It hasn't worked very well because Israel has moved much further right and moved towards annexing the West Bank, which has infuriated Arab popular opinion once again, which have made it known. And also because Congress didn't allow for this basic exchange between the UAE and Israel, and is putting up some of the same blocks in front of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE see that they're going to live as second-class citizens in a sense, in terms of technology, acquisition, and so forth. And they're going to move to China. They're going to move to Russia. They're going to not play this game. And because there are other alternatives today. And so the United States is putting itself in a position where it's going to end up with an Israeli ally, and it's going to alienate many of its other Middle Eastern allies. And this puts America in a very difficult position in the Middle East. It's always tried to somehow reconcile those two, and many presidents have moved forward with attempted two-state solution and peace agreements in order to reconcile them. Today, America's abandoned that effort. And it's hoping that the Arab world and the Islamic world will just close their eyes to the Palestinians and forget them. But that's, it's hard to imagine that that's really going to happen that way.
It's hard to do even for Americans to close your eyes to the Palestinians. I mean, it's just so heartbreaking see what Israel is doing and in creating an apartheid state. I mean, that's what really comes down to. And I think for the, I mean, we saw at the the Olympics in Syria, people showing up, with Palestinian flags. It's for the Arab person in the street, it's even more in their face than for Americans, and it's pretty much in my face right now.
Right.
Thank you for those comments. Yes. So Norma Harrison, you have a question?
I think so. I've put a lot of my comments additional to what has been being discussed. I so love mass peace. I think you all are terrific. And by and large, the positions that have been talked about are, I kind of support pretty much. But I find the approach here to be what is not uncommon, and that is kind of skating around the whole world, and also people talking about their technological ability to profess this or that point with regard to it. In the meantime, leaving out that there's a big difference between a profiteering social structure and an anti-profiteering social structure. I didn't quite get the comment about Cuba, but I think Cuba is heaven. Or not, I mean, I wouldn't go there, but except to visit. But as an establishment, as an addition to our struggle, and in the meantime, the whole thing is about profit. The whole motive and move and whatever, any aspect of this is about the profiteering by nations. China has been cutting back against the billionaires. I don't know if you noticed that. I haven't heard that you have, but they've been cutting back. They made use, the principle of struggling to build communism is do anything you can. That's how Stalin worked it. Just push for the revolution. You get a revolution going, maintain it and progress it at virtually any cost. Not at a cost of WW2, that was owned by the profiteers of the world that attacked Russia for that.
Okay, Norma, could I interrupt and just ask you if you've got a specific question on the Middle East?
Well, if anybody wants to respond to my what I'm saying about having not really gotten to the point of the issue.
And I know
Thank you very much, Paul.
We're about to lose Trita, so I just wanted to give him the last word and a chance to say farewell. In case before we lose you, you're muted.
So sorry, but I do have to leave. I have another thing that starts at 8 o'clock. But thank you all so much for this opportunity. Thank you again for the tremendous work that Mass Peace is doing. Thank you, Josh. Great seeing you again. And I hope to be in touch with all of you very soon. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Trita. Appreciate it. Josh, just to kind of close out our forum here this evening, most of us in the movement that Mass Peace Action is about are trying to figure out how to support people who are going through an awful lot in the Middle East, and how to support their efforts for societies that are independent and based on the welfare of their people. Given the dramatic developments in the area, what are the dynamics that will lead to those that have a hope of leading to that type of goal? Whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria, whether it's the Palestinians, where do people who want to express solidarity with ordinary people of the area, what are the policies? Around what issues is it best for us to organize, in your opinion?
Well, I think what you're doing by sending these links and putting pressure on congressmen is extremely important. I mean, that's, going out and voting and calling up and letting congressmen know, because they hear from a number of, well-organized lobbying groups, and there's very little to counter that. And that's where mass peace action really can step in and do something, because you are, in a sense, a lobbying group. And so I think following through on those things is tremendously useful. Another thing, of course, in a place like Syria, where people are so poor, is to send money to NGOs and to organizations that are on the ground. And the UN has been doing tremendous work. A number of UN agencies, the World Food Program is the biggest provider of food to over 4 million Syrians every month. So that's one way to go. And there are other agencies which I can send you. But I think those are the two best ways to do it, is to keep up the political action as you do, which is tremendously important. And then to make what contributions you can. And that's the, and keep on raising your voice, because when people hear you stand up for them, it gives them great confidence. And so all those things you do so well.
Well, thank you for that, Josh. Thanks very much. Just to close, I wonder if I could ask one very specific question. Many of us have worked very hard to end the war in Yemen, specifically to end U.S. support for the Saudi war. With all these changes going on, what prospects do you see for an actual end to that war and the independence of Yemen?
I think that things are moving in the right direction. With this China-sponsored peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, this has opened the door to real useful negotiations in Yemen. It's going to be very difficult because Yemen is now broken into a number of parts, 3 major parts, and it's going to be hard to bring them back together again. But Saudi Arabia realizes it's losing the war and it's trying to find its way out. MBS is trying to develop the country and grow its economy, and it cannot have Scuds coming over and hitting it. Same with the UAE. So they've all begun to withdraw from Yemen, and they're looking for a way out with Iran. And that is the best news that's going forward. And I think, that's partly due to China, and it's partly due to the loss of the war, that they've realized. They thought they would be able to re-engineer Yemen easily because they're so wealthy and they have such massive amounts of arms. But it turned out to be just the opposite. And that sobered people up, I think, a great deal.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, on that positive note, I think we can end here. I think we all have to, we would encourage at Mass Peace Action everyone to keep an eye on Yemen and to make sure that and to be very supportive of the negotiations between the Saudis and the Houthis and hopefully the other parties to actually end this war once and for all, and to let Yemenis decide for themselves what kind of country they want. So please, everybody, stay on top of the Yemen situation. Don't forget it until this thing is put to bed. And I appreciate everyone coming on tonight. Joshua, thank you so much for your time, for your insight, for your research, for the work you continue to do. And
Thank you.
And hope we'll be seeing you as these situations continue to unfold.
Indeed. Very good.